Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt commissioned Doolittle to plan a surprise retaliatory attack on Tokyo and other Japanese targets. Doolittle, who had the fabulous ability to inspire his men through leading by example, was offered any help he wished. 80 men were selected from the many who volunteered, and Doolittle chose the durable B-25, which could take off from the limited space of an aircraft carrier. The 16 crews knew it was a difficult mission, but only after their emergency takeoff at sea did they fully realize how suicidal the mission might be. The plan was to fly 400 miles off the Hornet, bomb Japan, and go on to remote airfields in China where they would refuel and then, they hoped, would return safely. Doolittle had promised the men that if they ever came back, he would hold the greatest party they had ever seen. Within striking distance, a Japanese boat spotted them. Although they destroyed it, Doolittle was unsure whether the Japanese were now alerted. He immediately launched his planes from the pitching deck of the Hornet. That was 10 hours early, putting them into China in the dark. Out of gas, they bailed out at night and lost all of the aircraft. 3 men were killed, but most were saved by the friendly Chinese and returned home. 8 were captured by the Japanese and tortured. Of these, 3 were executed. 1 died of illness, and 4 were released after 40 months in prison. One of those imprisoned and tortured was Jacob de Chazer, the bombardier in the last plane off the Hornet. He had joined the military out of intense hatred for the Japanese. 2 of his immediate crew were executed after being tied to small crosses. His captors tried to demoralize him by giving him a Bible, since it described the death of the Christian's leader by crucifixion, supposedly pointing up his weakness. Jacob de Chazer read the Bible in prison, and learning that Christ died for men's sins and rose from the dead, was converted to Jesus Christ. He found hatred for the Japanese replaced by an uncharacteristic love for his captors, and he vowed that if he were ever released, he would go back to Japan as a missionary. For 30 years, Jacob de Chazer preached Christ among his former enemies and established many Christian churches. A commander of the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was Michio Fuchida, a brilliant Japanese aviator who uttered the famous words, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Fuchida was the only officer involved in the Pearl Harbor attack to survive the war, once even breaking his legs in a fall and also jeopardizing himself by inspecting the ashes of Hiroshima. After the war, Fuchida became a farmer, and with a spiritual vacuum in his heart, one day he read the story of Jacob de Chazer. Fuchida obtained a Bible, was converted to Christ, and met de Chazer. Together they appeared at a huge rally in Osaka, where Fuchida publicly professed Christ as Savior, and 600 came forward to receive Christ as personal Savior. Fuchida later traveled throughout Japan, the U.S., and Europe, sharing his amazing story. In 1987, when Doolittle was 90 years old, several Gideons whose ministry is distributing Bibles befriended him and said, "Now we want to talk to you about Jesus Christ." Doolittle, who always had a Bible with him on his missions, expressed great interest and then stood to his feet at full attention and received Christ as Savior. Together those Gideons and Doolittle, with tears streaming down his face, sang "Amazing Grace." And right here I have to break in with something else, in addition to the article, because the New York Star-Ledger left out a couple of important paragraphs. About 3 years ago, at a previous gathering of his pilots, Doolittle declared, "Men, the greatest thing I have ever done is to accept Jesus Christ as my Savior." And one of those Gideons who led Doolittle to Christ was a man who had served in the German army. Rather astounding, since Doolittle had also bombed Berlin. And Robert Hite, co-pilot of de Chazer's plane and imprisoned with him for 40 months, also joined the Gideons organization and distributes Bibles.
And then, Dave, after that article was published, you learned some other exciting details as well.
Well, first, I had many who said they shared that story with others. And just a few weeks ago, I spoke at a 5-state Gideon retreat in southern New Jersey, and a man came to me saying he had copied and distributed the story for others and wondered whether he had done anything wrong. I said, "No, not at all. I'm just glad you could share it with others." But like you said, there is more. When Doolittle and his men bailed out over China, several were rescued and transported to safety through Japanese-controlled areas by a young Baptist missionary. Dressed like a Chinese, he arranged water and land transportation for the flyers to safety. That young fundamental Baptist missionary expressed to Doolittle how it was God's protection which had spared them. Yes, one of Doolittle's crew at the time had been killed, and the young missionary was commissioned by Doolittle to bury Corporal Leland Factor and any others who might have died and would be brought for burial. The very day the missionary was burying the corporal, Jimmy Doolittle was back safely in the States at the White House receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt. The missionary was a born-again, dedicated Christian named John Birch. He preached far and wide in China, often having multitudes come to Christ. Birch later became a captain in the U.S. forces in China, doing incredible feats for the U.S. victory and Christian endeavor. But only days after the war ended and Japan was defeated, Captain John Birch was cruelly slain by the Chinese communists, who mangled his body beyond recognition. Our government, much to its shame, covered up that story, even feeding outright lies to Birch's family. To their everlasting shame, some government leaders were convinced the best wave of the future lay with aiding the godless takeover by the communists under Mao Zedong, rather than the nationalists under Christian Chiang Kai-shek. John Birch's name was used by avid patriots to form the John Birch Society. Although it is fairly well known, the person and character of its namesake are largely forgotten, and almost no one remembers that General Doolittle and many of his men would possibly never have made it home to America were it not for the brilliant efforts of Christian missionary John Birch.
And because of all of this, there will be a fabulous meeting in heaven with former bitter foes and faithful friends.
Yes, there will be John Birch, Christian missionary who has been in heaven since 1945. General Jimmy Doolittle, saved at 91, joined him on September 28th. And in between, Michio Fushida went to be with Christ. As far as I know, Jacob G. Shazer and Robert Hyde are still awaiting that final homegoing. And someday we'll all gather at the feet of Jesus Christ and worship the Lamb for sinners slain. I've often said God's truth is stranger than man's fiction. God has his own unique agenda for salvation, and it often takes many years to see it come to pass.